Welcome back to Sci-fi Stories, and thank you so much for your continued support. Our channel has unfortunately been demonetized by YouTube, leaving us without an operating budget. So if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 to help pay our staff so they can afford their living expenses and keep creating for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the video description or comments. The Kalin Planetary Core Mining Station was a marvel of extraterrestrial engineering, a sprawling geometric fortress clinging desperately to the jagged rim of a lightless abyss. Ambient luminescent strips cut through the perpetual smog of the subterranean cavern, casting long, warped shadows across the landing bays. The air was thick, tasting heavily of sulfur and ozone, amidst the deafening roar of atmospheric equalizers and the rhythmic, bone-rattling hum of heavy extraction machinery. Anthony Atkins stood completely motionless. He was an anomaly in a sea of gleaming perfection. His bulky, archaic hazard suit, smeared with thick layers of industrial grease and scorched by cosmic radiation from 100 different spacewalks, made him look like a relic dredged up from a forgotten scrap heap. All around him, towering aliens glided through the cavernous halls, their sleek, elongated bodies encased in shimmering, semi-transparent energy armor that pulsed with a soft, ethereal blue glow. They moved with an innate, fluid grace, completely unbothered by the crushing atmospheric pressure that Kalin constantly exerted on its unwelcome visitors. Anthony stepped heavily toward the automated sorting gate, his reinforced boots clanking dully against the metallic grating. The station's advanced classification system, an unfeeling construct of crystalline logic, projected a harsh, crimson beam over his form, scanning his biological makeup from head to toe. A synthetic voice echoed through the cold, cavernous chamber, officially designating him as a lowest-level apprentice. It was a classification strictly reserved for biological entities deemed virtually useless by the galactic standard. The scanning system had detected a glaring flaw in his anatomy, a total absence of a natural defensive biomagnetic field. While the indigenous species of 1,000 different star systems possessed innate, passive energy shielding to effortlessly ward off environmental hazards and toxic spores, Anthony had absolutely nothing but fragile human flesh and a few millimeters of reinforced synthetic fabric separating him from sudden, violent death. He was, by all extraterrestrial metrics and calculations, an evolutionary dead end, a fragile creature that had no business being at the edge of a hostile planetary core. A sudden, sharp shift in the ambient light signaled the arrival of high royalty. Princess Valia of the Silari Empire strode confidently into the sector, flanked tightly by a heavily armed phalanx of elite guards. Her armor was a breathtaking masterwork of hard light technology, radiating an aura of absolute superiority and chilling arrogance that forced the surrounding alien workers to immediately lower their heads in fearful deference. She possessed a cold, statuesque beauty, characterized by pale, flawless blue skin and eyes that burned with the intensity of dying stars. Valia stopped just a few feet away from Anthony, her gaze sweeping over his grease-stained, bulky suit with undisguised aristocratic revulsion. With a dismissive, haughty flick of her slender wrist, one of her towering guards tossed a bundle of crude, manual digging tools onto the deck right at Anthony's feet. The heavy, unrefined metal clattered loudly and awkwardly against the pristine floorboards, shattering the ambient hum of the station. "Pick them up, human," Valia commanded, her voice ringing out crisp and clear, dripping with venomous amusement. "It is truly pathetic that the Intergalactic Council permits such weak, inferior creatures to set foot on a prime resource world. You have no shielding, no natural strength, and no genuine purpose here, other than to scavenge in the dirt, like the frail parasites your kind truly are." The elite guards chuckled in unison, a harsh, grating sound that echoed maliciously off the cold metallic walls. Anthony did not flinch. He did not raise his head to meet her mocking gaze, nor did he offer a single, foolish word of defiance. He simply swallowed his pride, slowly crouched down, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and gathered the rudimentary tools into his arms. As he did, his thick, insulated gloves brushed discreetly against a small, heavily modified seismic recorder strapped tightly to his thigh, while Valia and her arrogant entourage reveled in their perceived dominance, relying entirely on their colossal, orbital-linked sensors to map the cavern's stability. Anthony was tuned into a vastly different, more primal frequency. The delicate, analog needle on his hidden monitor was violently, erratically twitching. He was quietly logging highly irregular microtremors reverberating from deep within the unseen planetary crust. It was a faint, sinister, rhythmic pulse, a deadly, creeping detail that the highly sophisticated, fully automated Solari equipment had completely dismissed as meaningless background static. Hours later, during a routine, shallow mining test in Sector 4, the elite alien teams utilized massive, superheated plasma drills to effortlessly carve perfectly symmetrical tunnels through the stubborn rock face. Anthony was relegated to the rear, assigned to manually clear the mundane debris left behind by their destructive progress. He knelt silently beside a small, relatively unstable block of raw, volatile ore. He checked his concealed seismic monitor one last time. The rhythmic pulsing from the deep abyss was steadily growing slightly faster, shifting ominously from a dormant, sluggish heartbeat to something violently restless. He knew with absolute certainty that the sudden, aggressive influx of heavy mining vibrations was rapidly disturbing the delicate, ancient equilibrium of the deep crust. With cold, calculated precision, Anthony attached a rudimentary, handcrafted chemical fuse to the small ore block. He struck a spark, keeping his body perfectly still. The resulting explosion was utterly insignificant by advanced extraterrestrial standards, yielding nothing more than a mere puff of acrid smoke and a handful of shattered rock. Yet, the specific acoustic resonance it generated was perfectly angled to bounce off the hard cavern walls and travel directly downward. The rebounding sound wave acted as a dense, impenetrable acoustic blanket, washing heavily over the deep subterranean sensors of the Solari mining machines. For precisely 30 seconds, the station's infallible monitoring grid registered absolutely nothing but the localized, harmless echo of his minor blast. And in those crucial 30 seconds, entirely hidden beneath the clever cloak of Anthony's engineered distraction, something utterly massive and terrifying shifted deep beneath the planet's thick shell. A colossal, nightmarish shadow stirred in the absolute, crushing darkness of the abyss, its horrific awakening entirely masked from the glittering, arrogant eyes of the surface dwellers. Anthony merely adjusted his firm grip on the heavy, crude shovel and continued to dig, silently waiting for the inevitable slaughter to begin. For exactly 7 days, the subterranean cavern trembled under a relentless, brutal assault of advanced industrial might. Princess Valia and her elite royal detachment shattered every previously recorded extraction metric in the entire history of the Kalan orbital logs. Their colossal, automated plasma excavators chewed through the dense, rocky crust 24 hours a day, hauling up thousands of tons of refined, hypercharged minerals. The Solari technology functioned flawlessly, emitting a constant, high-pitched whine that drowned out the natural agonizing groans of the planet itself, far removed from this dazzling display of dominance. Anthony remained strictly near the designated perimeter of the established safe zone. He knelt quietly in the damp, unforgiving dirt, meticulously using his bare, gloved hands and a dull iron scraper to collect insignificant, fractured crystal shards that the massive machines had recklessly discarded. To the alien overseers, he was a pitiful, useless scavenger. Yet, Anthony's focus was entirely disconnected from the glittering prize of the harvest. His eyes were firmly locked on the analog needle of his concealed seismic monitor. The subterranean pulse he had detected earlier had escalated into a frantic, erratic drumbeat. The vibrations were no longer microscopic anomalies. They were transmitting a tangible, terrifying pressure straight through the thick rubber soles of his heavy boots. To commemorate their unprecedented triumph, Valia orchestrated a lavish, ostentatious celebration right in the heart of the central command plaza. The immense hall was bathed in blinding, iridescent light arrays, and the thick air hummed with the deafening rhythm of synthetic victory anthems. Dozens of high-ranking Solari aristocrats clinked crystalline goblets, their shimmering energy armor reflecting the intoxicating glow of complete success. Anthony stood near the heavy cargo airlock, a silent, grease-stained shadow observing the blinding spectacle from the periphery. The sheer volume of the alien music and the boisterous laughter created a highly dangerous sensory blind spot. Suddenly, Valia ascended the main observation dais, demanding immediate silence with a sharp, arrogant wave of her glowing staff. Her piercing gaze swept over the gathered crowd and landed squarely on Anthony. "Behold the grand architecture of our inherent superiority," Valia projected, her voice amplified flawlessly across the plaza. "In merely 1 week, we have surpassed our mining quota by 300%. And yet, the Intergalactic Council forces us to drag absolute dead weight. Look at this human. He contributes nothing but the dirt on his boots. He is a pathetic parasite, feeding off the margins of our glorious enterprise. It is time for him to board a supply shuttle and return to his frail, insignificant star system, before he taints our perfect record with his profound, biological incompetence." A chorus of cruel, mocking laughter erupted from the elite guards and the gathered technicians. The heavy, suffocating weight of 100 hostile stares pressed heavily down on Anthony, demanding his immediate humiliation and cowardly retreat. But Anthony felt an entirely different kind of pressure. The soles of his boots were violently, uncontrollably vibrating. The analog needle on his thigh monitor violently snapped past the red line, the delicate glass casing cracking audibly under the extreme, unseen kinetic force. The rhythmic, slow pulse had completely stopped. It was abruptly replaced by a continuous, rapidly ascending geological surge. The unknown entity in the abyss was no longer simply waking up. It was rushing aggressively towards the surface, ignoring the hostile glares and the venomous jeers. Anthony turned his back on the princess and walked with alarming, purposeful speed directly toward the central command terminal. The arrogant technicians were far too busy laughing to stop his steady advance, without a single word of warning or explanation. Anthony grabbed the massive, physical main atmospheric control lever and slammed it downward with all his physical strength. He instantly severed the central power grid to the entire sector. The blinding celebration lights died immediately. The synthetic music choked out in a digital gasp. Most importantly, the massive acoustic dampening shields that protected the mining station from the deafening, ambient roar of the planetary core instantly collapsed into nothingness. Total darkness and absolute heavy silence swallowed the plaza for one terrifying fraction of a second. The sudden blackout instantly triggered widespread, chaotic outrage among the alien nobility. "Seize that miserable creature!" Valia screamed in the sudden dark, her royal energy armor flaring brightly as her guards drew their heavy plasma rifles and charged blindly toward Anthony's position. But before a single elite guard could cross the metal plaza, the cavern angrily answered the darkness. A monstrous, mind-piercing roar erupted from the gaping crevice at the edge of the station. It was not a conventional sound meant for acoustic hearing. It was a dense wave of pure, concentrated psychic agony that violently slammed into the fragile minds of every single alien present. The incredibly expensive, state-of-the-art orbital warning systems remained entirely silent, definitively proving they had been absolutely blind to this biological terror from the very beginning. The proud alien aristocrats dropped heavily to their knees in agony, clutching their elongated skulls as their crystalline goblets shattered uselessly on the metal floor. From the pitch-black maw of the abyss, the first night hunter launched itself into the panicked station. It was a terrifying explosion of pure kinetic violence, moving with a wind-tearing speed that utterly defied physical logic. A massive, shadowy mass of barbed chitin, razor-sharp scythes, and dozens of glowing, crimson eyes lunged straight for the nearest target, the towering guard captain who had previously thrown the digging tools at Anthony. The alien captain weakly raised his plasma rifle, but his reaction time was fatally hindered by the crippling psychic shockwave. He was guaranteed to be violently torn apart in less than 2 seconds. Anthony did not hesitate. He had already primed a handcrafted chemical flare in his left hand the moment the lights went out. With a precise, brutally practiced motion, he hurled the volatile metal cylinder directly into the calculated path of the leaping beast. The chemical mixture detonated violently upon physical impact, releasing a concentrated, blinding flash of pure white magnesium fire and a thick cloud of highly caustic, choking smoke. The intense, utterly unshielded flare instantly seared the dozens of hypersensitive, unadjusted crimson eyes of the deep dweller. The massive monster let out a deafening shriek of physical pain, its forward momentum breaking just enough for its lethal, bladed scythes to smash harmlessly into the reinforced metal decking, missing the paralyzed Solari guard captain by mere inches. The horrific creature violently recoiled, thrashing wildly in the caustic smoke, buying the horrified, bleeding aliens a brief, precious moment to realize that their undisputed reign at the top of the galactic food chain had just brutally ended. The station overseer's voice cracked over the station-wide emergency intercom, completely devoid of its usual bureaucratic authority and dripping with unadulterated fear. He screamed for an immediate, total evacuation of all primary sectors. Panic, raw, and violently contagious, instantly flooded the Kalen Command Center. High-ranking aristocrats and seasoned technical engineers alike abandoned their meticulously cultivated dignity, surging like a terrified, mindless herd toward the massive primary orbital elevator shafts. However, their desperate rush for salvation was already entirely obsolete. When the heavy, blast-resistant steel doors of the main transit hub finally groaned open, they did not reveal the sleek, waiting passenger pods meant to carry them back to the stars. Instead, a collective, suffocating gasp of pure horror rippled violently through the fleeing crowd. The immense, hyperalloy transit cables and the central energy cores powering the ascent mechanisms were completely choked and immobilized by thick, violently pulsating biological roots. These grotesque, alien tendrils, slick with a foul-smelling, highly corrosive necrotic resin, had aggressively burrowed upward from the abyssal depths. They wrapped around the vital machinery like colossal, parasitic serpents, slowly crushing the structural integrity of the metal. The elevators were utterly dead, permanently fused to the cavern rock by the rapidly expanding hive architecture of the Night Hunters. The entire alien crew was entirely trapped, buried alive billions of miles away from the nearest intergalactic rescue fleet. With the primary escape route entirely destroyed, the heavy, suffocating reality of their grim situation aggressively descended upon the survivors. Without the central power grid, the station's atmospheric life support systems would completely fail in exactly 4 hours. The only remaining option was a desperate, suicidal mission into the absolute depths. Princess Valia, her flawless pale blue skin now entirely drained of its vibrant color, and slick with a cold, uncharacteristic sweat of pure terror, hastily rallied her elite royal detachment. They had to manually descend on foot into the lowest, completely unmapped levels of the cavern system, a pitch-black labyrinth formally designated only as the Dead Zone. Their singular objective was to manually restart the backup thermal core generator. However, every geological scan ever recorded by the station indicated that the Dead Zone was the geothermal epicenter of the abyss. It was the exact location where the biological horrors had undoubtedly established their primary, festering breeding nest. The hunters were no longer just an abstract concept whispered about in horror stories. They were a looming, physical nightmare, waiting hungrily in the dark. Valia's elite guards practically shook in their boots as they frantically calibrated their heavy plasma repeaters and maximized the energy output of their hard light armor, desperately trying to construct a fragile psychological barrier against the rapidly creeping dread that threatened to paralyze their hearts. Amidst this frantic, terrified preparation, Anthony quietly stepped forward and fell into line directly behind the heavily armored infantry formation. He did not ask for royal permission to join the squad, nor did he beg for a protective plasma rifle from the lavish royal armory. While the alien warriors burdened themselves heavily with massive, energy-draining fusion cannons and highly sophisticated thermal tracking gear, Anthony carried practically nothing of conventional value. He simply hauled a heavy, 10-gallon industrial drum of highly volatile, corrosive solvent slung haphazardly over his right shoulder with a severely frayed canvas strap. In his left hand, he tightly gripped a massive, spooling coil of thick, industrial-grade copper core cable. His archaic, unshielded hazard suit, still heavily smeared with toxic grease from his previous shift, offered absolutely zero physical protection against the razor-sharp chitin claws of the impending swarm. Yet, his breathing remained incredibly steady, and his heart rate was entirely undisturbed by the surrounding chaos. He moved with the grim, cold, and calculated purpose of a man who fully understood the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of deep space survival, while the supposed apex predators surrounding him were rapidly collapsing under the sudden, crushing weight of their own fragility and mortality. The incredibly heavy airlock doors leading down to the Dead Zone groaned open with a sickening metallic shriek, immediately exhaling a powerful gust of hot, putrid air that tasted strongly of rotten sulfur and decaying biological matter. The absolute, suffocating darkness of the lower unmapped caverns was instantaneous, aggressively devouring the faint red emergency lights bleeding in from the upper levels. Panic instantly flared wildly within the disciplined ranks of the elite guards, completely unable to endure the psychological torture of the suffocating blindness. The squad leaders simultaneously activated their maximal environmental defense shields. A brilliant, blinding aura of ethereal blue and stark white aurora light violently erupted from their advanced armor suits, aggressively pushing the heavy shadows back into the crevices. It was a spectacular, awe-inspiring display of superior technological power, brightly illuminating the jagged, flesh-covered stone walls of the steep descent tunnel. But it was also a fatal, incomprehensibly arrogant mistake. "Turn off your shields immediately," Anthony stated flatly, his voice a cold, deadpan monotone that easily sliced right through the anxious, rapid, heavy breathing of the royal guards. In a deep space, nutrient-starved predatory ecosystem, a localized light source of this immense magnitude does not provide safety or clarity. It acts strictly as a dinner bell. You are loudly, violently inviting absolutely everything hiding in this pit to come and consume you alive. Princess Valia furiously snapped her head around, her wide eyes reflecting a volatile, unstable mixture of pure, animalistic terror and deeply wounded aristocratic pride. She was absolutely terrified of the oppressive, physically crushing darkness pressing in around them, and the radiant, familiar glow of her royal armor was the single thing preventing her fragile mind from completely shattering into pieces. She violently pointed the tip of her glowing command staff directly at Anthony's chest, her slender hand visibly and uncontrollably trembling. "I will not take tactical advice from a blind, unshielded, lower life-form primitive," she spat viciously, her voice shrill and echoing with absolute desperation. "We are the elite of the Solari Empire. We do not cower in the dark like frightened vermin. We will aggressively purge this filthy hive with holy light and superior fire. Keep the energy shields firmly at maximum capacity and keep the formation moving downward without hesitation." She blindly ignored the incredibly logical warning, clinging stubbornly and pathetically to the hollow illusion of her racial supremacy. It took exactly 3 minutes for the devastating consequences of her hubris to violently manifest. As the heavily illuminated, tightly packed formation descended deeper into the rapidly expanding subterranean cavern, the ambient temperature suddenly plummeted. Then, the rhythmic, constant dripping of acidic water entirely stopped. A terrifying, deeply unnatural silence heavily blanketed the dead zone, feeling vastly heavier than the crushing physical atmospheric pressure of the planet itself. The pitch-black darkness resting just millimeters beyond the edge of their brilliant blue light radius began to violently shift and contort. It did not happen slowly or gradually. It happened in one single, terrifying heartbeat. Without a single warning cry or a rustle of loose stones, the absolute blackness surrounding their glowing defensive bubble abruptly peeled open like a rotting wound. First, there were 10, then 50, then an endless, churning ocean of hundreds of glowing, blood-red eyes suddenly ignited in the dark, encircling the alien squad completely in a perfect, inescapable spherical trap. The silent creatures had crawled effortlessly along the high ceiling, the uneven floor, and the jagged walls, drawn entirely and inevitably by the blinding, arrogant beacon of the alien energy shields. The horrific, overwhelming sound of thousands of barbed, metallic claws aggressively scraping against hard stone rapidly echoed from every conceivable direction. The royal detachment was entirely cut off from the surface. The steep tunnel behind them was completely sealed shut by a massive, writhing wall of monstrous, shifting shadows. Suddenly, the massive vanguard of the horrific swarm aggressively threw themselves directly against the outer perimeter. The sheer, overwhelming kinetic mass of the heavily armored, bloodthirsty creatures violently crashed into the defensive hard light bubble. The elite guards screamed in absolute terror as their supposedly impenetrable energy shields instantly flickered wildly. Deep, jagged warning cracks instantly spiderwebbed completely across the shimmering blue barriers. The highly sophisticated energy projectors, whining in agonizing mechanical failure under the impossible, crushing weight of a relentless predator swarm that had finally, easily cornered its glowing, utterly terrified prey. The initial impact was not a conventional clash of battle. It was a sheer, unrelenting tidal wave of biological mass violently colliding with failing technology. Hundreds of apex night hunters hurled their heavily armored, monstrous bodies directly against the shimmering perimeter of the Solari defensive sphere. The hard light projectors, meticulously designed by the greatest minds of the Empire, to easily withstand the glancing blow of a stray meteor or the localized heat of a heavy industrial plasma drill, were completely unprepared for the concentrated, rhythmic battering of focused kinetic strikes. Razor-sharp talons, forged and hardened by countless millennia of brutal subterranean evolution, dug furiously into the ethereal blue barrier. For exactly 3 agonizing seconds. The high-frequency whine of the portable generators reached a deafening, unnatural pitch that vibrated painfully against the teeth of everyone present. Then, with a catastrophic, echoing sound that closely resembled one million fragile glass panes shattering simultaneously. The entire defensive grid completely collapsed. The blinding, comforting aura of the royal guards instantly died, plunging the tight military formation into a terrifying, flickering twilight, illuminated only by the dying. Erratic sparks of their overloaded power packs and the countless, hateful crimson eyes pressing in from the absolute void. The sudden lack of physical resistance threw the front lines of the alien predators violently forward, their massive, drooling jaws snapping viciously at the exposed, panic-stricken guards. Princess Valia collapsed heavily onto the jagged cavern floor, the sheer, crushing reality of her impending doom entirely shattering the fragile, crystalline illusion of her royal supremacy. For her entire, immensely privileged existence, she had been heavily insulated by the absolute certainty that Solari engineering was the undisputed pinnacle of the cosmos. Her people conquered star systems with perfectly calculated algorithms and sterile, orbital bombardments. Now, stripped of her radiant armor and facing the raw, uncompromising brutality of a primal, starved ecosystem, she realized she was nothing more than soft, unprotected flesh waiting to be violently consumed. She stared with wide, unblinking eyes at the towering monstrosities rearing up to slaughter her elite protectors. A profound, icy despair entirely hijacked her advanced nervous system, believing with absolute certainty that a swift, vaporizing death was infinitely preferable to being torn apart and dragged screaming into the lightless breeding pits below. Valia numbly reached her trembling, pale fingers toward the recessed, crimson console embedded deep in her chest plate. It was the absolute failsafe, a highly restricted hyperfusion self-destruct sequence specifically designed to instantly incinerate everything within a 200-foot radius. She tightly closed her eyes, breathing rapidly, fully prepared to completely erase her own existence, rather than suffer the ultimate, degrading indignity of becoming mere prey for lower life forms. Before her slender digit could even graze the glowing activation rune, a heavy, grease-stained glove shot out aggressively from the surrounding gloom and violently smacked her wrist away. The sheer physical force of the unexpected strike sent Valia sprawling awkwardly backward into the damp dirt. She gasped sharply, her eyes snapping open to see Anthony standing directly over her. He did not offer a single word of comfort, nor did he make a grand, heroic declaration to rally the broken troops. His face, partially illuminated by the dying sparks of the broken generators, was entirely devoid of fear, locked instead in an expression of cold, mechanical calculation. Without a single second of hesitation, Anthony reached down and hoisted the heavy, 10-gallon drum of highly volatile industrial solvent he had stubbornly dragged all the way from the surface. In a terrifying move that utterly defied every known instinct of biological self-preservation, he completely inverted the heavy metal container directly over his own head. The thick, viscous chemical cascaded heavily over his worn hazard suit, instantly soaking the reinforced synthetic fabric from his battered helmet straight down to his heavy, reinforced boots. The sharp, suffocating, eye-watering stench of the raw solvent violently punched through the stagnant cavern air, momentarily confusing the advancing predators. Then, calmly, with a chillingly steady hand, he retrieved a crude analog friction sparker from his utility belt. "Watch closely and learn exactly how a Deathworld species ensures its own survival," Anthony stated flatly, his voice utterly devoid of any dramatic inflection or panic. He struck the flint mechanism hard. The resulting spark caught the heavy chemical fumes instantly. A massive, roaring pillar of bright orange and toxic chemical green flame violently erupted into the suffocating darkness, completely swallowing the human whole. To the horrified, staring aliens, it appeared to be an act of profound, mind-breaking madness, a purely suicidal gesture born from absolute, paralyzing terror. But the raging flames did not consume Anthony. The specific industrial solvent he had carefully selected from the surface storage was highly reactive to the toxic, sulfur, heavy atmospheric composition of the kaolin lower depths. Instead of burning inward to scorch his fragile human flesh, the violent chemical fire burned aggressively outward. The intense thermal reaction instantly bonded with the heavy subterranean gases, forcefully expelling a dense, incredibly thick cloud of hyper-corrosive acid fog. The roaring flames danced and whipped across the surface of his heavily insulated suit, turning him into a terrifying, walking inferno, a living, breathing star of pure toxic destruction. Before the apex predators could fully comprehend the sudden, blinding heat source erupting in their midst, Anthony charged directly into the thickest, most densely packed wall of the monstrous swarm. He whipped his arms forward with brutal force, violently unleashing the heavy, industrial-grade copper core cables he had tightly coiled around his forearms. The solvent-soaked metal cables ignited instantly, transforming into twin, roaring whips of pure kinetic fire. Anthony swung his arms in wide, devastating, perfectly calculated arcs. The blazing copper lines carved perfect, terrifying circles of screaming death right through the suffocating darkness. Wherever the flaming cables struck, they did not merely burn or singe. They violently detonated upon high-speed physical impact, splashing, boiling, highly acidic chemical plasma directly onto the heavily armored carapaces of the alien beasts. The impenetrable, hardened chitin of the deep dwellers, which had easily and flawlessly deflected Silari high-energy plasma bolts just moments before, instantly melted and dissolved into a foul-smelling sludge under the extreme, localized chemical reaction. The subterranean cavern suddenly echoed with an entirely new, horrifying sound. It was not the arrogant, terrified screams of dying alien aristocrats, but the agonizing, high-pitched, bone-chilling shrieks of the undisputed apex predators being violently, systematically butchered. Anthony moved through the chaotic battlefield like a localized natural disaster, a relentless, burning hurricane of toxic vapor and slashing kinetic fire. He ruthlessly cleaved a wide, bloody path right through the writhing mass of monstrous bodies, stepping heavily and indifferently over the dissolving, violently twitching corpses of the beasts that dared to lunge at his blazing form. The dense, highly caustic fog billowing endlessly from his burning suit actively melted the incredibly sensitive sensory organs of any creature foolish enough to approach his immediate perimeter, effectively blinding, suffocating, and disorienting the terrifying hive mind. Princess Valia and the severely battered surviving members of her elite royal guard remained entirely frozen on the cavern floor, their highly evolved, deeply arrogant minds violently struggling to process the impossible, physics-defying spectacle unfolding directly in front of their widened eyes. They watched in absolute silence as a supposedly frail, lower-tier biological entity deliberately ignited his own body and single-handedly slaughtered a massive horde of unstoppable subterranean nightmares, using absolutely nothing but raw chemical volatility, industrial garbage, and savage, primitive momentum. The absolute, unshakable certainty of their galactic hierarchy was not just briefly challenged. It was violently, permanently eradicated from their collective consciousness. They were forced to sit in the damp dirt and watch in stunned, breathless awe as the fragile, unshielded human completely dominated the unforgiving darkness, proving through sheer, terrifying, illogical brutality that the absolute most dangerous weapon in the known universe was not advanced energy shielding or royal bloodlines, but the terrifying, boundless adaptability of a species that had evolved in hell. The relentless momentum of the subterranean massacre suddenly ground to a sickening, jarring halt. The endless, surging tide of jagged chitin and gnashing teeth faltered, breaking against the fiery bulwark of the human. It was not a conscious tactical retreat, but a deeply embedded, ancient biological imperative, forcefully seizing control of the swarm. Deep within the primitive, highly specialized olfactory glands of the night hunters, a terrifying new chemical profile was being frantically analyzed and instantly categorized. The overwhelming, suffocating stench of the burning industrial solvent was horrific enough on its own, but it was merely the loud carrier for something vastly more intimidating. Underneath the acrid smoke, completely saturating the dense cavern air, was the unmistakable, overpowering scent of human adrenaline. To the alien predators, entirely accustomed to the terrified, cold-blooded panic pheromones of fragile, docile prey, this massive hormonal eruption was completely alien and deeply alarming. The human body was rapidly, aggressively, flooding its own bloodstream with vast quantities of a highly potent survival stimulant, pushing its muscular and nervous systems well past their standard structural limits. The predators did not smell a frightened victim desperately clinging to life. They smelled a highly volatile, completely unhinged rival predator, aggressively preparing to fight to the absolute, bloody death. This sudden, shocking revelation violently shattered the collective cohesion of the lower pack. The smaller, younger drones of the swarm, driven primarily by basic, unrefined survival algorithms, began to physically recoil in sheer terror. Hundreds of the lesser beasts hissed in profound confusion, their previous predatory confidence completely evaporating as they rapidly scrambled backward into the suffocating darkness, desperately seeking immediate refuge from the burning, impossible phantom. However, the momentary lull in the horrific slaughter was violently deceptive. While the mindless infantry hastily retreated, the true, calculated terrors of the deep calmly emerged from the shifting shadows. Dozens of massive, heavily scarred alpha hunters, undisputed veterans of countless, unseen subterranean wars, completely ignored the burning chemical fog. These towering, nightmarish specimens possessed substantially thicker armor plating and highly advanced, predatory cognitive functions. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized silence, their heavy, clawed appendages making absolutely no sound against the rock as they deliberately fanned out to flawlessly encircle their singular target. With cold, calculating intelligence, the alphas did not blindly rush the blazing human. Instead, they cleverly utilized their sheer, intimidating physical bulk to systematically herd Anthony backward, step by agonizing step. They aggressively forced him entirely away from the scattered, bleeding alien survivors and pushed him directly toward the treacherous, jagged edge of the massive geothermal energy rift, perfectly positioning him over a bottomless sheer drop directly into the planet's boiling core. Anthony stoically maintained his aggressive defensive stance, his flaming copper cables still actively dripping highly corrosive, molten acid onto the scorched stone. But the intelligent alphas had quickly learned to stay exactly 1 inch beyond his maximum physical striking distance. Their massive, highly developed nervous systems were heavily stimulated by the intense, unprecedented challenge of cornering this strange, burning anomaly. Recognizing that a direct physical kinetic assault against the human would unequivocally result in unacceptable biological losses for the pack, the high-level predators seamlessly and flawlessly shifted their hunting paradigm. They entirely abandoned the concept of kinetic violence and immediately resorted to their most devastating, deeply ingrained evolutionary weapon. The heavy, armored crests resting atop their elongated, nightmarish skulls began to violently pulsate, glowing with a sickly, bruised, purple bioluminescence in the dark. In perfect, terrifying unison, the alphas initiated a concentrated, devastating barrage of telepathic waves. It was not a physical sound that could be blocked by thick armor or deflected by energy shields, but a highly pressurized, completely invasive cognitive assault specifically designed to completely scramble and permanently destroy the delicate neurological pathways of their victims. The heavy air inside the cavern, heavily distorted and rippled, visibly laden with pure, agonizing mental static. The devastating effects of the psychic bombardment were brutally instantaneous on the fragile, highly complex minds of the alien nobility. Princess Valia and the severely battered, terrified remnants of her elite royal guard, still kneeling helplessly in the damp dirt, were violently struck by the invisible tidal wave of immense telepathic pressure. Their highly evolved, delicate brains, meticulously tuned over millennia for complex mathematical calculations and highly sophisticated, serene, high society interactions, possessed absolutely zero natural biological insulation against raw, predatory psychic violence. The elite guards instantly dropped their heavy plasma weapons, aggressively clutching their elongated skulls as they collapsed entirely to the cavern floor. Agonizing, blood-curdling screams violently tore from their throats, echoing terribly in the chamber. The concentrated, merciless waves instantly shredded their highly sensitive eardrums, causing thick, dark blue blood to aggressively stream from their ears, wide eyes, and noses. The horrific, unrelenting psychic pressure aggressively dismantled their cognitive functions, violently tearing apart their core memories and entirely, permanently extinguishing their final, desperate hopes of survival. They were instantly reduced to violently convulsing, mindless husks, completely broken and hollowed out by the sheer, terrifying weight of the predator's collective mental wrath. Anthony stood completely alone at the absolute precipice, entirely surrounded by the pulsating, deadly psychic resonance of the Alpha Pack. The human mind, however, was a profoundly different, incredibly dense, and heavily scarred biological engine, brutally forged in the chaotic, high-stress crucible of a planetary death world. The invisible psychic waves washed heavily over his skull, causing intense, blinding migraines and severe, disorienting vertigo. But his primitive, incredibly stubborn brain violently refused to fracture or submit. Yet, the telepathic assault was merely a horrific, paralyzing prelude. The Alphas were not actively trying to kill him with their minds. They were merely pinning the prey down to properly prepare the ultimate sacrifice. Deep within the absolute, lightless depths of the colossal rift directly behind Anthony's heels, the true, undisputed epicenter of the nightmare finally awakened. The entire subterranean cavern violently convulsed, the heavy, solid stone floor aggressively heaving and fracturing beneath his reinforced boots as an utterly massive, incomprehensible tectonic force violently pushed upward from the abyss. From the pitch-black void, the absolute sovereign of the subterranean hive slowly, deliberately slithered up into the flickering, dying light of the chemical fire. It was a leviathan of unimaginable, terrifying proportions, its heavily plated, jagged obsidian carapace easily the size of a heavy orbital dreadnought. The physical temperature in the cavern plummeted drastically to a freezing chill as the colossal beast emerged, its sheer, immense physical mass silently crushing the jagged stone walls into fine, powdery dust with every minute adjustment of its gargantuan body. The sheer gravitational weight of its terrifying presence seemed to violently warp the very air. The ancient overlord did not bother with complex psychic waves or coordinated pack tactics. It possessed the absolute, undeniable authority of a living, breathing god within the eternal dark. It loomed heavily over the jagged precipice, entirely eclipsing the massive cavern ceiling and greedily swallowing all remaining ambient light. Slowly, with terrifying, agonizing inevitability, the towering nightmare opened its massive, cavernous jaws, the foul, deeply decaying stench of millions of consumed corpses aggressively rolled outward from its cavernous throat. A localized hurricane of pure, unadulterated death. Hundreds of rows of jagged, crystalline teeth, each single tooth significantly larger than a fully armored Solari elite warrior, gleamed maliciously in the fading, toxic firelight. The Leviathan violently lunged downward, the sheer physical force of its sudden movement creating a powerful, localized vacuum that forcefully threatened to pull everything directly into the abyss, fully intending to completely crush and devour the single, defiant, burning speck of fragile human life that had dared to illuminate its eternal, undisputed darkness. The massive jaws of the Leviathan descended, promising instant annihilation. At that precise fraction of a second, Anthony did not run. He planted his heavy boots firmly on the trembling precipice, drew a massive breath of the toxic, burning air, and unleashed a primal, violently explosive roar. This was not a mere cry of desperation. It was a calculated, deep chest vocalization specifically pitched to generate a highly destructive acoustic resonant frequency. The sheer, concentrated sound wave violently pierced the dense air and crashed directly into the delicate, highly exposed psychic sensory organs of the colossal beast. The invisible telepathic network that bound the entire subterranean hive together instantly shattered like fragile glass under the immense acoustic pressure. The catastrophic biological feedback was instantaneous. The Leviathan violently snapped its massive jaws shut, emitting a deafening, agonizing shriek that physically shook the foundations of the cavern. Its immense, unassailable predatory confidence was entirely crushed in a single, mind-breaking moment. The sheer, incomprehensible shock of encountering a prey item that could actively weaponize sound to destroy its nervous system broke the ancient monster. Trembling violently, the towering overlord of the deep aggressively tucked its massive, armored tail and recoiled. The remaining alpha hunters, their shared consciousness violently ripped apart, completely abandoned their coordinated attack. Driven entirely by raw, unfiltered terror, the entire swarm aggressively turned and slithered straight back down into the absolute, lightless depths of the bottomless abyss, desperately fleeing the terrifying, blazing anomaly that had completely broken their predatory spirit. The sudden, absolute silence that immediately followed was heavier than the crushing Kalan atmosphere. The brutal life or death knot had been violently untangled. Anthony stood perfectly still at the edge of the void, staring down into the darkness for exactly 10 seconds to ensure the retreat was permanent. Then, with an eerie, terrifying calmness, he calmly reached down and smothered the remaining chemical flames, dancing across his heavily insulated suit. The thick, toxic smoke slowly cleared to reveal his hazard gear entirely scorched and blackened to a crisp, shedding heavy flakes of dead, synthetic material. Yet, as he casually popped the heavily damaged pressure seals and removed his cracked helmet, the frail human flesh underneath was completely flawless, untouched by a single burn or scratch, moving with the mundane, unbothered efficiency of a factory worker ending a long shift. He picked up the remaining spool of thick copper wire, walked over to the dormant thermal generator core, and expertly spliced the heavy kinetic lines by hand to forcefully jumpstart the station primary power grid. The massive orbital elevators shrieked back to life, rapidly hauling the traumatized, violently humbled alien survivors back to the gleaming surface command center. As the heavy steel doors opened to the blinding, sterile lights of the medical bay, Princess Valia refused the immediate assistance of her frantic royal physicians. Her flawless blue skin was stained with dried blood and thick, subterranean mud. She walked slowly, deliberately toward Anthony, who was casually leaning against a heavy cargo crate, in front of the highest-ranking aristocrats and the entire command staff. The proud Solari princess dropped to one knee. She heavily bowed her head, pressing her forehead against the cold, metallic floor deck in a gesture of absolute, undeniable submission. She publicly apologized for her profound arrogance and officially recognized the grease-stained human as the singular, undisputed ultimate warrior of the celestial realm. Within exactly 2 hours, the panicked Central Ruling Council urgently initiated a deep, comprehensive reanalysis of Anthony's supposedly inferior biological data. When the highly advanced algorithms finally decoded the environmental history of his home system, the alien commanders were struck with profound, paralyzing horror. They realized that humanity did not evolve in a peaceful, carefully manicured garden world. They hailed from a chaotic, violently unstable death world where constant, merciless natural disasters, highly lethal predatory ecosystems, and brutal atmospheric extremes had relentlessly forged their fragile biological structures into the most adaptable, terrifying survival weapons in the known universe. The infallible Central Registry System automatically updated Anthony's galactic profile. The glowing digital text instantly deleted the humiliating title of lowest-level apprentice. In its place, blazing in stark red warning letters, the system assigned him a new classification of immeasurable disaster level. An entire empire now deeply feared the solitary man standing in their hangar, completely ignoring the terrified whispers and the wide, staring eyes of the alien elite surrounding him. Anthony simply walked over to the station automated commissary, swiped his grease-stained identification card, and calmly requested 1 cup of extremely strong black coffee. Thank you so much for listening to today's story to the very end. We would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments. As mentioned earlier, our channel is currently operating without a budget. If you found today's story captivating and want to support our creative journey, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen right now, or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description or pinned comment. Your generous contribution allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can afford their living expenses and continue to produce more amazing sci-fi stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next adventure.